You are tuned into the Business Talk. I am Deepak, your host, and together we will explore insights that shape the future of business. We are honored to welcome Professor Rajendra Srivastava, former Dean of the Indian School of Business and Novartis Professor of Marketing Strategy and Innovation, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Professor Srivastava brings over 40 years of expertise spanning scholarship, academic leadership, and global consulting. Before joining ISB, he served as a provost and deputy president of academic affairs at Singapore Management University and earlier held distinguished research chairs and senior leadership roles at the University of Texas at Austin and Emory University, an internationally recognized authority on marketing strategy, brand equity, and marketing metrics. Professor Srivastava's research spans business model innovation, customer and brand management, and the impact of marketing facing processes innovation, supply chain, and customer management on shareholder value. His recent work emphasizes growth through services, B2B markets, technology, and emerging economies. A highly cited scholar and recipient of numerous awards, Professor Srivastava has shaped new postgraduate and doctoral programs, founded research centers, and fostered industry academic collaboration worldwide. Known for championing cross-functional integration and interdisciplinary research, Professor Srivastava bridges academic rigor with practical business insights, drawing on experience across both Western and Asian markets. In this episode, Professor Rajendra Srivastava explores his research, transforming traditional business models from legacy systems to agile operations, offering insights into how organizations can adapt, innovate, and thrive in a rapidly changing business landscape. So, without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Rajendra Srivastava to the podcast. Dr. Srivastava, thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you, Deepak. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've been following you on the internet, and you are very, very active. So I'm glad to participate in your quest. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, much of your work on business innovation requires a change in mindset if one is succeed in today's dynamic tech-driven markets. How are companies that lead market today different in terms of strategic investment, business models, and operations?
And I think this is a very insightful question that you're asking. I think it's important to think how businesses today are different, or how the environment today is different from, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. If I go back to the 70s, let's say, or the 80s, or even the early 90s, the most successful companies were vertically integrated. Okay, so these would be companies, let's say, like General Motors, there would be companies like IBM, or in Europe, it may be companies, like Siemens. Now, in that era, 40, 50 years ago, what were business investments? Investments were factory, plant, equipment, inventory. These were tangible assets that, that the board had to invest in. If you look at the companies that are successful today, you take Microsoft or you take Indigo, from India. What you find is that these companies are having to invest in human capital. So it's not labor cost anymore. There's a difference when you use the word cost. Intention is to minimize it. But when you say capital, then it's an investment that drives it. So what is important today is technology, it is human capital, it is the capability of doing things, and it is things like the brands. So interestingly, when you look at this ratio called, it's the price to book ratio, which is the market price to the balance sheet value. What you will find is that for tech companies, it may be as high as 15 to 1. But it's not just the tech companies. If you take even Hindustan Unilever or ITC or Dabur, that ratio is running over 10. If that ratio is running over 10, it means that less than 10% of the value of the company is on the balance sheet. Then you have to say, where's the other 90%? All right, so the 90% is in things that we don't measure. It is the networks, it is the capabilities, it's the ability to utilize assets. So you and I could have access to the same brand, but my brand managers may know how to manage them better than your brand. So that capability is also an important, consideration. So largely, I would say that earlier on, we were investing in tangible hard assets. Today, we have to invest in intangible assets, intellectual property, human capability, brands, and networks. And vertical integration, command and control, doesn't work anymore because we can't be the best at everything. The second thing that I want to mention, and this may be more to do with India than a worldwide phenomena, and certainly it may also be something that affects Europe, let's say relative to North America. What we do in India is that many of the businesses are family controlled. And family does not necessarily want to let go of the control. So, how do we reward managers? We reward them on the ability to produce profits, EBITDA. All right? So, now if I'm a manager and my bonus is going to come on EBITDA, what is the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to hold down expenses. And that expenses could be R&D expenses. But I look better and my bonus is better if I preserve the past. On the other hand, when you take the US, what happens is the senior manager, somebody at the C level, is getting an good annual contract. Then they have a bonus related to performance that has been agreed upon. But a very large segment of their compensation is coming from employee stock option plans, which is related to how the company will do versus how the company did perform in the past. So this is what is leading to investing in the future, let's say in North America, and investing in the past in India. Europe is somewhere in between. It is more like India, in my opinion. And that is why what happens is that in many, many industries, the ideas used to come, if I go back 30, 40 years ago, companies like Philips came up with very good technology and ideas. But those ideas were commercialized either by Japan or by the US. So this is one thing that I kind of wanted to point out, that it is the nature of the assets as well as the reward systems. If you want people to do X, reward X.
Very insightful. Professor, what inspired your research into transforming traditional business models? And why is agility such a critical factor in today's market?
This actually started a long time ago. It started, maybe you can call me a confused academic. You can call me an accidental academic. You can call me somebody who really didn't know what he wanted to do. So I could not make up my mind when I was doing my PhD whether I was interested in accounting or finance or, marketing or strategy on the other side. And I came out of IIT Kanpur as an engineer, so I kind of knew how to handle the quant side. I also knew that I would get paid more as a finance professor or an accounting professor. But I found those subjects at that time very boring. As an example, in finance, the big thing was the capital asset pricing model. So the idea was, how do I diversify my risk? Okay, so that's one of the outcomes in finance. You diversify your risk. I was more interested in how do I manage the risk? What is leading to uncertainty? What can I do to control outcomes rather than kind of spread them out? So because of this, I was tinkering. I was doing significant work in marketing strategy, but at the same time, I was tinkering in finance. I wrote a very nice paper called Information Costs and Portfolio Selection. In simple English, what that paper was doing was the following. It said that if you know more about Mumbai real estate, and I know more about Hyderabadi real estate, I'm going to invest in Hyderabad, and you will invest in Mumbai because we will make fewer mistakes in the markets that we know better. So my conclusion was that when information is not freely available or not easily digestible, such as in this case, an example of real estate, you're knowing the Mumbai market, me knowing the Hyderabadi market, we will specialize. And so that was a interesting paper in that sense. But people discovered that this fellow Raj Srivastava knows finance, is interested in it, also knows marketing. So around the late 80s, there was this whole issue of marketing accountability. How do we hold senior marketing managers accountable? And what is the value of a brand, as an example? So I was very lucky. There's an organization called Marketing Science Institute. And they requested me to see if I would be interested in hosting a conference on brand value and brand equity. This is 1988. So that's how I got involved in the value of brands. In 1994, I was the co-editor of a special issue of Journal of Marketing Research on the value of brands, on brand equity. So now I'm embedded in the value of brands. Now, the value of brands is itself related to market presence, the ability to leverage networks. So if you think of Coca-Cola, it's a good brand, but the greatest strength is the Coca-Cola bottling and distribution network. It is hard for anybody to replicate that. Now, that network doesn't show up on the balance sheet, but certainly leads to. So I got involved in brand equity. Then in the mid-90s, I get a call from Texas Instruments, from the chief executive, because I used to do some executive teaching there. And the chief executive at Texas Instruments said, "Sir, his PA called me. He said, 'Sir, we know you're in Boston at a conference, but on the way back, could you possibly stop off in Dallas on your way to Austin, Texas?'" So I went there and I had a conversation, with the CEO's office. And basically the statement was the following, that our technology is just as good or better than Intel's. But we are tired of Intel running circles around us. So would the University of Texas take 50 of our best and brightest tech people and convert them into strategy people? And that is what led us to design a program in technology strategies. Now, what I discovered during that program, that the value did not come entirely from the core competencies. You may remember this term, core competencies. Our own C.K. Prahlad talked about the value of sticking to the knitting. Okay, so if you're good at product design, stick to product leadership. If you're good at managing cost control, stick to efficiency, operational efficiency. What I discovered in doing this analysis, in building up the program for Texas Instruments, that the value lay at the intersection of these processes. So what were some successful companies or companies that were coming up and getting to be successful? These were companies like Dell at that time. Remember, it's in the 90s. Now, Dell was combining supply chain, or what we call upstream operations, with downstream operations, which is CRM. So the Dell model was integrating supply chain and CRM, and you can call it demand chain. But the made-to-order process was integrating these two things. So what I discovered was that companies like Dell were succeeding because of integrating supply chain and customer intimacy. And companies like Honda at that time, that was another successful company, was combining product development with customer insight. Now, today we call it design thinking, but at that time, the phrase design thinking did not exist. But again, the Honda strategy was at the intersection of product design, product leadership, and customer intimacy. So that led me to conclude that when you're able to integrate processes, and you needed technology to integrate those processes. Okay, and that led to a business model that others could not copy easily. Okay, so that's how I got started. And then as we have had more and more technology, particularly digital technology, what was important in the 90s has become 5 times more important today. So speed and agility were already getting to be important. The ability to absorb ideas from an ecosystem was getting important. And it was clear that you would not win just by yourself. And you had to win by pulling people along with you. And that is what kind of led me to my interest in companies like Microsoft. And it led to the conclusion that the value laid in what I call market-based assets. You did not own those assets. Coca-Cola distribution network was owned by somebody else, but it's the access and those market-based assets that really made the company valuable. Now, what I called market-based assets in the 90s is today called ecosystem management. Okay. So I was just 15, 20 years ahead, just because I worked with industry. And I only have to thank industry because it's through listening to them, through trying to understand them, that we academics get ideas that are really what are the problems that are worth working on. Otherwise, we can do our own academic research.
Very inspiring. Professor, how do tech-enabled platforms like data analytics and AI and digital operating models accelerate or hinder these transformations?
Well, so the first thing we have to understand is what do we mean by platforms? So this platform idea is not new. It goes back to the 50s. So, we had product platforms those days. So again, I mentioned Honda earlier on. So I could not say, well, you can ask the question which I used to ask in class and I still do. How do you park 6 Hondas in one garage? Okay. It could be a Honda City. It could be a Honda motorcycle. All right. Before we got a certainty in power, many of us had Honda power generators when we had a brownout or a blackout. And you can use, the Honda. You could have a motorcycle, but if you live on a lake, you could have one of these wave runners, or you could have a snowmobile. So what was core to Honda was the small engine technology. And in developing that small engine technology, whatever improvements they came up with could be used in automobiles, could be used in motorcycles, could be used in power generators, and so on. So that small engine was the platform. Now, if I move to, let's say, Microsoft, okay, you use the Office suite, you use Outlook. I use something called OneDrive because I travel all over the world, and I suspect you cannot live without OneDrive, right? So what happens is that for Microsoft, the customer is the platform. So they're looking at you and me and saying, what else can Deepak use and what else can Raj use? So in this case, the effort, the investment has gone into acquiring Raj as a customer or acquiring the Indian School of Business as a customer. And then the question is, how do we, sell more products? Now, the greater the number of Microsoft products I use, the harder it is for me to leave Microsoft. All right. So it's called a lock-in strategy. Now, Apple is doing something similar, right? They're locking you in with the wristwatch and the phone and this, that, and the other. So these, when we start looking at this locking in process, then what is happening is you're making money from the same customer across different products. So the greater the number of Microsoft products I use, the more valuable a customer do I become, right? And the same thing would hold for Uber or Ola. Now, the problem becomes that sometimes you have a multifaceted market. So you take Uber, okay, you're a customer. But is the driver a customer also? So if you make the rider very happy, you're going to make the driver less happy because you can make the rider happy by lowering the cost. But then the driver is unhappy. So when you're doing a multifaceted market or an ecosystem, and this is what companies like Microsoft also have to worry about. How much do we charge the buyer? How do we create a win-win situation for everybody who's selling on the platform. Anyway, to make a long story short, what happens is that we are now getting flywheels. Okay, Apple starts with one product and keep adding another. Similarly, Microsoft is doing the same thing. Can you tell, for example, what industry does Amazon belong in? They started as a retailer. They developed technology to service the vendors that were selling and the buyers who were buying for the platform. What they developed for retailing became AWS, right? Then with AWS, they started providing streaming services to Netflix. And they said, oh, if we are providing video streaming services for Netflix, why can't we launch our own Amazon Prime Entertainment? Okay. And then, since we are retailing, oh, by the way, there's not much difference between a retail bank and a retailer. So we can get into fintech. And once we're into fintech, so now they're also getting into healthcare. So this is the flywheel effect, and this is where technology and information is being used in order for companies to grow. So the capability is in how do you visualize the future use of insights and information. We're no longer looking at the past, we're looking at the future.
Professor, how do you define legacy systems in the business context? And what are the most common challenges they create for organizations?
Legacy systems, we basically tend to live in the past. Okay, so what happens is that, you've heard the term core product many times, right? So this is our core product. We got to protect it. So what your instinct is to protect your core business, your main products. What happens if a new technology comes in? You say, well, I hope it'll go away. So let's say I take one industry, telecom. The old legacy system was wireline. If I go to the United States, you had AT&T, and then it got broken up into 7 bells and so on and so forth. But they were the infrastructure part of the telecom industry. Now along comes wireless technology. The existing telecoms are making money in the millions of households that they're serving, and they don't want to disrupt that. So they're a little bit hesitant. And what we find is that there was, yes, a substitution between wireline and wireless, but it took maybe 10, 15 years in the US for that to happen. Now you come to a country like Thailand or India. We did not have good services. I remember when I was growing up, our phone number in Lucknow was 3313. Okay, 4 digits. It means that there were at most 9,999 phones in Lucknow at that time. Then a decade later, it became 23313. But there used to be a 5-6 year time gap for you to apply for a phone before you would get one. So yes, there was a legacy system, but it was useless. Along comes wireless, and they did not have to fight any incumbent in order to move into the market. I can make the same analogy for education. Coursera goes into the US, they've got a wide university network, they've got overcapacity, and that overcapacity industry is trying to fight the new way. In India, we don't have any options. So India is going to be most successful in implementing online learning. And I can say the same thing for medicine. Telemedicine will move a lot faster in India than it moved in the US. And where we struck not just gold, where we struck diamonds in India was in finance because of the India stack, but simultaneously because of telecom. See, it's the Indian telecom that took fintech and BFSI into rural India. So when I go to Europe or I go to North America and I look at what we can do in the cafeteria at ISB, they cannot do it at a leading mall out there. So I think we have to be sometimes thankful we don't have a legacy system. But the legacy systems, what it means is that the past is trying to sacrifice the future. And when you combine these with accounting rules and so on and so forth, and this is a big problem. When you think of an S curve, what happens is at the front end of the S curve, you don't make any money. Where do you make more money? When things are beginning to mature and you're getting volume, etc. So what is happening is that the mature companies are trying to resist the new ones. And I can go industry after industry. Again, since we're talking about telecom, 15, 20 years ago, what was happening is that the Motorola and the Nokias were resisting the Blackberries, and then later on, Android and Apple. So there's a natural tendency for the incumbents to try to stick to the past. Okay, so that is a big problem. And the problem has three sources. One is the core product. Second is the structure, how the company is structured. So company, you'll find in companies that the most important division and the most important, senior VP is going to be managing the largest, division. And they have the greatest clout. And they are the ones who hold back innovations. So companies that take smaller starting units and let them operate on their own under different rules, they are more likely to succeed. So I'm a big proponent of something I call multiple business models. Let different businesses, different product markets within the company operate independently.
When businesses set out to modernize, what are the key indicators that signal it's time for a fundamental shift rather than incremental change?
The fundamental shift is going to be when there's a new attribute that comes in. Right? Since we started talking about telecom, what's the big difference between, let's say, AT&T wireline? I mean, I could call, but I could call India, but I remember a call to India would be like $10 for a 5-minute call. Right? Now what we're doing is we are chatting on WhatsApp for free. Right? So one thing we have to look for is what is technology doing to the cost structure. Right? The second thing is that very often it's going to, when a new attribute is added. So in the old wireline format, you might remember, I think you're old enough, I certainly am old enough, to realize that when we got a phone call and we wanted mobility, we used to walk around with the phone around the room and it had a long wire and we could wander around the phone while we were talking to people. Now we can wander anywhere we want to. And how reluctant are you going to be to give up your wireless mobile phone and go back to the old technology? It's not going to happen. The same thing holds, let's say, for BFSI. In the old days, you call up the broker, you'll get a quote, you'll do some numbering, this and that, you scratch your head, say, kya kare? Now, when you sign in, the moment you sign in, your portfolio is already updated. And you click here on this news item, you get this information. You click there, you get that information. So we are not going to go to the past. Very often, what the new technology is doing is adding a new attribute. All right. Similarly, think of air conditioning. It has, we used to have desert coolers, right? We blew water through, through the, we blew air through the water, and we had desert coolers. But what is happening with air conditioning? It is more freely available, but it is not humid. So when a new technology is adding a new attribute, now supposing I asked you, so Deepak ji, how would you like a phone that you never had to charge? I can see the smile on your face. I wear a watch. I wear this watch. I bought it in 2001 in Changi Airport. and I don't have to rewind it, and I don't have to replace the battery. And it does not rely on sunlight. It can even the light in this room works on it. So imagine if this what is running the watch, if that same battery technology could be used, for your phone, and you never had to charge your phone, you'd be very happy. Now let's move that to something like a something like an ICD unit. These are defibrillators that people wear who have arrhythmia. And to replace these ICD units costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars and lakhs and crores of rupees sometimes, right? Now imagine if you did not have to replace that ICD unit because you could charge it externally. So very often it's going to be a capability that comes with a new attribute. So that is one element. The second element is it's going to very often come not from your industry. One of my mentors, a person called George Dale, he's a renowned chair professor at Wharton School in Pennsylvania. He wrote a book called Peripheral Vision. So the attack is not coming front and center. Apple almost died in the late 90s. They thought they were a hardware company. And what almost killed them was Microsoft, which was a software company. Right? So this is what we have to keep in mind. Now I'll throw out another zinger, which is already feasible and being talked about. Supposing Mr. Musk came out with a global phone that did not need a SIM card, that worked in every corner of the world, with data being managed by satellites and which never had to be charged. Will that disrupt Apple or Samsung or Xiaomi? And from your smile, I can see it would. Right? So anyway, it's new technology, but adding a new dimension, and it need not come from straight. It may be something that's happening on the side. And so, for example, when we have new technology coming in using telemedicine, that may be something that shakes up the healthcare system.
Dr. Srivastava, can you share a case study where a traditional company successfully transitioned to a more agile operating model and what made it work?
I probably will be much better in giving you the other answer, the ones that did not make it. Changing is very, very difficult. And because there are multiples, as I mentioned earlier, is this belief that this is my core product. Then the other thing is processes. What is my budgeting process? So how do we allocate money to new ideas? After we've taken care of all the existing ideas. So your idea has to be very good or very bad for the budget to be cut or for budget to be allocated to new. So I call that the tyranny of budgets. Another is a tyranny of headquarters. So for example, when the computer industry was already stagnant in the US, let's say growing at 2 or 3%, this is around the turn of the century, around 2000. It was growing at 35% in China. It was growing at 15% in India. So obviously, in China and India, you had to invest in that industry. In the US, you would have to be a little bit more controlled. And so what happens is there's also something called tyranny of headquarters. People in headquarters tend to live with the world that surrounds them. One of my mentors liked to use the phrase, we are all prisoners of our past. I would like to add to it and say we are also prisoners of our present. And what we have trouble is thinking of outside our box and of the future. So the people in companies like Hewlett Packard could not think of what needed to be done differently in China compared to in Cupertino. So that's the tyranny of headquarters. Now I can give you other tyrannies also. There's also, there's Are you fluid? Are you able to execute? And that's a tyranny related to old ways of doing things that many people will tell you this is what we do. When I moved from the US, from Emory University to Singapore Management University, I went in as the chief academic officer. So one of the things I had to do was to transform the IT system. That was part of my job. And the IT system was only 7, 8 years old. It's not that it was 20 years old, but at 7 years it was already antiquated. And we were looking at that time whether to start embracing cloud and this and that. And what I did was I looked at who was around and I appointed a person who was only 37 years old. I said, you head up the task force because he seemed to know more than anybody else and more enthusiastic. So I put him in charge of the task force to come up with the straw models as to what are the new ideas. This was on a Friday. On Monday, I got 2 resignations from people who were 43 and 45 respectively because they were insulted that I gave the leadership job to a 37 years old. Now, this is seniority, right? In Commonwealth, we worry about seniority. In the US, I had learned on merit. So this is also what holds change back. So to give you some example, now you asked me the question of successful ones. I'll give you 2, maybe 3. Number 1, if you think of Microsoft under Bill Gates, you have some image of Bill Gates in mind, right? Then you have Microsoft under Steve Ballmer. Okay, let's fight it out. Is here and now performance. Then there's Microsoft under Satya Nadella. So these people have operated at different points in time, but Microsoft was stagnating, about a decade ago. And what they were doing was they were sticking to the old products. And what happened under Satya Nadella, and I'm oversimplifying things, is that Microsoft started looking for ideas from the bottom because the bottom is what's in touch with the market. So the ideas were coming from the bottom, but the top had to understand what is worth doing and then say, okay, this is what we've decided and this is how we're going to support it. So the ideas have to come up from the bottom, ideas have to come from the market, but the conviction and the support has to come from the top. So this is a very simplified model of what I think helped Microsoft, listening to the market a lot better and listening through people who were on the street, who were engaged, with the clients. Another example would be Samsung. Samsung almost went out of business in the late 90s. And we heard of the Asian financial flu, and these guys were just in trouble as anybody else. And what they discovered as they were looking around is that their products, they were basically a contract manufacturer. The few products that they had were not differentiated. They were very much like India competing on price. And they said, look, we can't do this. We're going to have to invest in new technology. So we have a differentiation. So they had the efficiency, but now they said we need the differentiation. So they invested in display technology. And it was Samsung televisions that used to carry the Sony Trinitron label. So it's a Samsung product, but Sony made more money. They said, we need to change that also. So now you see Samsung as a leading brand, and it's a better known brand today than Sony is. So there were 3 things: operational efficiency, product leadership, customer intimacy. So this integration was done by Samsung over time, but it took them 20 years to do it. It's not like we press the button and bindas. Okay? Third companies, possibly General Electric, everybody points a finger at them and saying, look, they screwed up and this and that. And yes, they screwed up. But the problem was that they were a conglomerate that worked very well at one point in time. But as the world got more technologically driven and more polar, that old model was not working. All right. So what they had to do is they had to divest themselves off and become a lot more focused. And so General Electric today is a leaner company. If you saw what was happening to the stock for about 20 years, it was drifting. And if you look at what has happened to the stock the last 2 or 3 years, they've become much more focused. And the stock has correspondingly gone up. So so it's not that they were not digitally focused. They were one of the first companies that started talking about how do we use sensors and IoT and this, that, and the other to manage, manage the infrastructure projects they were involved in. The intent had been there, but they got too caught up in financial maneuvering, and so they lost the tech focus. But now they appear to have it back. So these are my 3 examples. If you're looking for a new one that is doing it right, I'd point my finger at Indigo. We got to learn a lot from what, Rahul Bhai is doing.
Yeah. Dr. Srivastava, conversely, are there examples of transformation efforts that failed, and what lessons can be drawn from those experiences?
Well, we've already talked about the many that failed. So, since we talked about telecom earlier, I'll say, all right, Motorola failed at the hands of Nokia. Nokia failed at the hands of BlackBerry. BlackBerry failed at the hands of Apple. And now Apple and Android, they're kind of fighting it out. And so the lesson that we learned from this is that you cannot, you can't just live in the past. And that in order to succeed, you have to put the past aside and move on. Now, it is easier said than it is possible to implement. And what you need sometimes is that you let the present compete with the past. But let the present be a separate operating unit. I spent a lot of time in Austin, Texas before I moved, into Atlanta and then to Asia. And since Dell was a company that was born there, many of my students worked there. I was in very good terms with the CFO, etc. I learned one phrase from Dell: small is beautiful. So if something is growing and it becomes too big, it becomes bureaucratic, you break it up. As an example, let's say Dell had an education market. Then as that grew, break it into K through 12 and higher education. So you have different managers managing it, so they'll stay more focused. So this is one thing that I learned. The other thing that I learned is that Dell used to be a call center company. Okay, they sold on phones. Then call centers started competing with online. Now, what was the benefit on online? It reached new markets. So they found orders coming from 30% of the orders coming from countries where they did not even have distribution. So your reach increased and your cost structure came down. So what they did was they let Dell call center operations run on their own. And they put somebody else in charge of Dell Online with a separate budget and separate leadership. So it is better for you to cannibalize your own product than to have competition to take business away from you. So, that's possibly, another thing. But there's so many examples of companies that have failed. I can go to relative sense. Look at IBM. They used to lead the world, and now nobody really talks about them. They're still a very important company, but nowhere in the stature that they used to be. And the other companies in the telecom business like Alcatel and Lucent, and where are they? And so this is a problem. We have many that have failed, and they failed for the reasons that we talked about, living in the past. Now, in order to succeed, I think companies have to reinvent themselves. And I gave you the three examples. These are hard to come by examples, by the way. Philips has not been able to reinvent itself. I'm waiting for Sony to reinvent itself. So not that is a much more difficult task.
Professor, what role do leadership and organizational culture play in moving from legacy system to agile operations?
Leadership plays a very important role because somebody has to decide what is the right thing to do. And I mentioned in the earlier examples I mentioned IBM. Sorry, I mentioned Microsoft, and how Microsoft was very different under Gates versus Ballmer versus Nadella. All right, and the the change, wherever the ideas are coming from, the change needs to be ultimately driven from the top. And you have to align what is good for the company with incentives. So since I mentioned Indigo, all right, now Indigo is known as a company that is on the move, and they've done well. They've done well because they've embraced technology. They've invested in the tangible assets, planes. They've invested in the intangible assets, data systems, analytical capabilities, how to reroute planes, how to do dynamic pricing, how to train, when you're expanding the business at the rate they've been expanding, how do we train all the pilots? How do we train the crews? How do we train the back? The human capital has to be retrained. So what needs to be done in terms of the leadership is that they have to be willing to change from the past, but they have to be willing to take risks. And a good leader, in my opinion, is not going to pass the blame. Okay? So those leaders who say, I'm making the decision. If things don't go right, it's my problem. But you provide cover to those people who you instructed to do things. And so, that's one dimension that I've found. The second dimension that I think is very important is in today's world, since we're talking about leadership more broadly. See, in the old world, we had a vertically integrated organization. It was all command and control. Why let a competitor or a channel member make money when I could make money? So in that kind of an environment, strategy came out of the Greco-Roman way of thinking, right? Genghis Khan, or for me to win, somebody has to lose. That kind of thinking. When we're managing an ecosystem, for me to win, you have to win, sir. Okay? Otherwise, I don't have the strategic partners that I need. So I think in this kind of an environment, you need a leader who understands managing internally, but also understands how to manage externally. And the leaders have to, in my opinion, I would say they need to lead the competition. So I kind of think of multiple models. One way to use technology is to say, well, how am I going to use technology to make better, more efficient decisions? So I'm improving the efficiency, so it's an improvement model. When I say I'm going to use technology to transform the way I do things, all right, that is the kind of thing that Dell went, going from call center to online. They're transforming the entire company. A third way to look at it is saying, how do I use technology to disrupt the industry? And this is what Microsoft did in 1995 when they came out with Windows. Okay, they put the reset button. And in the new framework, I was talking about customer lock-in. If I ask the question as to what's the customer retention rate at Microsoft, the answer will be 99%, with the remaining 1% resting in peace. The other comment I can make is that intangible assets like brands and customers are the only assets that appreciate. They do not depreciate. Okay? The Coca-Cola brand is more valuable because there are more drinkers today than there were 100 years ago. Plain and simple. So these intangible assets appreciate. So the leaders have to understand the environment, they have to understand the people who work within the companies, and they have to find a common ground to work with the competitors. So some competitors could be your partners in project A and they're your competitors in project B. And the final one is, the final area that I was mentioning is I would call digital control, where the leadership can lead the pack. All right. So when we look at Android, it has to lead the pack. Well, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Dr. Srivastava, what metrics or performance indicators best capture the impact of transitioning to an agile business model?
This is where I get into trouble with all my colleagues. See, many people, especially sales and marketing, what metric do we look for? We look for growth, right? CAGR. And we'll look at other metrics like market share, because as a marketing person, I'm looking at market share. What's my strength in the market? Well, I'm not saying these are unimportant, but these are metrics that are based on revenue. Now, some people have said, no, we shouldn't look at revenue, we should look at profitability. All right, that's an improvement in the right direction. And so profitability means not only scale, but margin. So we've added another dimension to it. And then what are we going to do to get that higher margin, which is product differentiation and so on. So I move from revenue to profitability. Now, in addition to profitability, what we're looking for is growth. Right? So, because that's what the stock market is rewarding. So it's not last year's profits, but are you going to make money this year? So those of us who own stock, and if you ask us in simple English or Hindi, kya chahiye? We will say that, yeah, we don't want to lose money. We want to make more money, and can we make it quicker, please? Right? So we want higher profitability, higher growth, and lower risk. That is what we need. So the metrics have to include profitability, they have to include growth, and in my opinion, they have to include risk, and that results in market capitalization. So I look at success not in revenue growth, not in profit growth, but in terms of growth in market capitalization. That is why I am so proud of a company like Indigo. Okay, look at how quickly they have gone up the value ladder. Or you take a company like State Bank of India and say, oh, State Bank, quasi-government bank or YOVO. But they've got one product called YONO. You need only one. And that's a technological innovation. And my best guess is there are only a few thousand, maybe 2,000 people who work to support YONO. And State Bank of India has 220,000 employees. So you got 1% of your workers providing you a platform. I can dig into the numbers, but I'm willing to bet that they had a large part to do with perhaps over 50% of the profitability of SBI. Now, State Bank of India is the third most profitable entity in India after Reliance, Oil and Natural Gas Commission of India, and they're the third most profitable organization in India. They are more profitable than HDFC. But you have to say, why is HDFC 50% more valuable than SBI? So we have to look at not only what we have, how do we leverage technology, we also need to be able to look at what we don't need. Okay, in this day and world, this day, when was the last time, I don't know where you bank, when was the last time you went to the bank to take out a loan or to make a deposit? I'm willing to bet you haven't done that in at least a year, if not many years. So do we need all these branches? Right? So I'm just kind of raising the questions. And I think if we were looking in terms of market capitalization, the winner is HDFC in Indian BFSIs. If I'm looking at profitability, the winner is SBI. Okay, you make up your mind whether you want your stock to be worth more or to be worth less. Your choice.
Very nice. Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, how do you see the concept of business agility evolving, especially in emerging markets and high growth sectors?
I see, one of the great things about growing markets, by the way, don't call it emerging markets. There's nothing emerging about China. There's nothing emerging about India. We have already emerged. We are growth markets. Well, what do you do in a growth market? You have to grow, right? So the biggest risk that you can take is not taking the risk to grow. Which now, in order to grow, what do we need to do? We need to invest in the future, not worry about the past. What we need to do, we know that in the future, it's not going to be factories and equipment. It's going to be intellectual property. It's going to be R&D. It's going to be human capital. It's going to be brand. Now, these things are regarded as expenses. Marketing and sales is an expense. R&D, the salaries paid to research scientists in India are considered an expense. So if I am a CEO, and I'm being rewarded on EBITDA, I don't want to spend that money. But we need to change that mindset. We need to invest in R&D. We need to invest in the brand. There's no point, whether we're talking about textiles or we're talking about Pudina coming from UP, that we manufacture or we grow, then China converts it into a product. So let's talk about Pudina. I come from India, grows about 80% of the world's mint, Pudina. 80% of India's Pudina comes from UP, and 80% of UP's Pudina comes from the Lucknow area. So we grow the Pudina, but it is Wrigley's chewing gum that uses mint in a finished product. But that mint is manufactured by the Chinese. So that chewing gum is manufactured by the Chinese. So we have to start looking at the end product. We can't just keep doing things that others brand. We brand textiles. Marks and Spencer's brands them, and then we go to London and buy it ourselves to bring it back. So we need to invest in brands. We need to invest in distribution systems. We need to invest in technology. We need to invest in R&D. We need to invest in people. And I can say that the environment, the India growth story, is providing us a perfect platform to grow on. We will be the biggest fools to not take advantage of it. And so I will once more repeat the statement I think I made earlier. The biggest risk is not taking the risk.
Thank you, Professor Rajendra Srivastava, for sharing your invaluable insights on transforming traditional business models and navigating the shift from legacy system to agile operations. Your experiences and case studies have given us a deeper understanding of how organizations can adapt and thrive in today's fast-changing environment. We appreciate your time and perspective, and we look forward to seeing how your work continue to inspire both business leaders and scholars around the world. Thank you so much for having us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepak ji.